our speaker is Liam Burnside, our own Liam Burnside, who's a master's student at REES, graduating this spring, I think, right? And I received what Liam has called the perfect short bio, so I'm going to base my introduction on this.
Partly sourced from other sources, to be fair.
Liam Burnside is a third-year MA student in the REES program. He spent his second year in Moscow studying at the Higher School of Economics, where he first became interested in identity studies. He's since then increasingly become more interested in applying this to Central Asia studies. In summation, he's really known for three things: taking care of business every day, taking care of business in every way, and taking care of business working overtime.
Yeah.
And the title of his presentation, as you can see, is Being Tajik Beyond Ethnicity and Nationalism. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Justina. I have to be honest, though, that may or may not have been from Randy Bachman. However, no one can be sure. Anywho, so starting, I had a professor in undergrad who once told me that the easiest way, or the most effective way rather, to start a talk on a dense topic, and he was a cognitive neuroscience professor, so I imagine all of his talks were very dense, was to open with an anecdote. So, in the spirit of that, I recall this. About a year or so ago, I was walking along the streets in Moscow near the metro Vedennekhe with a very close friend of mine who I most endearingly refer to as Ksushenka. We were having a seemingly mundane conversation, however it stands out to me now. My friend asked me in jest if all Americans were as arrogant as I was, to which I responded that my arrogance was from my French side, to which I asked her, are all Russians as sarcastic as she was, to which she responded that her sarcasm was from her Tatar side. And then we stopped to get ice cream and American hot dogs. Looking back on this conversation, it is reminded that we all wear many hats, that some are more significant than others, and the choice of hat or aspect of identity that we choose to put on every day is highly situational. Bashiri describes identity as results of interactions among a multiplicity of phenomena, which gather around a sensitive core and give it expression. Since the interactions among the contributing phenomena are diverse, the relations that emerge from the interactions are too necessarily diverse and fluid and thereby susceptible to change. Of the competing and entangling phenomena that go into comprising one's identity, the most contentious and consequential of which may very well be ethnicity. When I think about ethnicity as a determinant, or rather the determinant of identity, my mind often wanders to negative places. I think of Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, Burundi, Jews in Europe during World War II, Bosnian Serbs in Yugoslavia. However, these are cases of ethno-identity politics that are novel in the grand scheme of things and should not be viewed as typical or representative of how ethnicity is operationalized in the political sphere. The majority of people only see ethnicity as a polarizing or othering factor when told to do so. It is when certain ethnic groups believe that their basic needs are not provided for as direct interference from other ethnic groups that it becomes a polarizing factor. And this is an act almost exclusively done by essential authorities such as government or outside forces, which allow me to expand a little bit. Ethnicity is a concept that is consciously present, albeit with a passing awareness. This applies to those whose basic human needs are provided for. For those that are not provided for, ethnicity is generally looked over because prioritization of needs dictates survival needs first and then nuanced social needs, i.e. ethnicity. Looking at it through a purely Maslowian lens, I simply propose that it's untenable to suggest that those who do not have the basic essentials for survival are terribly concerned with how they ethnically or otherwise identify. Making it super simple, if our physiological needs are not met, then one simply can't bother with needs at the highest levels, such as esteem and self-actualization, where we would hold ethnicity and identity. And though the role of ethnicity and identity in Tajikistan is certainly one that deserves exploration, and the observable phenomenon of identity-related dissonance and variation in ways Tajiks self-identify is of course consequential, I'm of the opinion that the largest impediment hindering state-building initiatives in Tajikistan is the socioeconomic situation. As Laurel puts it, being able to give work to the youth, to the younger generation, will soon be a key in terms of political and economical life in the country. However, this may be misleading, so allow me to state this explicitly. Identity is important, ethnicity is important. They both are extremely consequential in Tajikistan and Central Asia largely, and they play a significant role in nation and state-building initiatives. Where I deviate from others, say the president of Tajikistan, is in regard to the order in which the amelioration of Tajikistan's economy must take place, where he is ostensibly of the opinion that state building will come as a natural step after national cohesion or a collective feeling of being Tajik. I'm of the opinion that if there is nothing incentivizing the inhabitants of Tajikistan to identify as Tajik, such as employment, financial security, state-sponsored social programs, infrastructure, etc., then they simply will not. And if they do not see themselves as being part of a greater whole, the Tajik people or even the Tajikistani people, then they won't work towards building the economy, bolstering national cohesiveness, or other state-building initiatives. Which brings me to my thesis. Argue that socioeconomic amelioration will not be the result of national cohesion, but rather the opposite. National cohesion, i.e. collective identity, cannot be achieved until and only until socioeconomic situation in Tajikistan has been significantly improved. So, to begin, we will look at a few things. First, we'll look at the concept of identity and ethnicity and how these are operationalized and active today in Tajikistan. By doing this, we'll look at the Samanid narrative, we'll look at identity and its relationship to Islam in Tajikistan, and we'll look at regionalism and how this often supersedes nationalism in Tajikistan. Furthermore, we look at theories of nations and nationalism and how they're pertinent to the situation, how we can apply them to our understanding of what's happening in Tajikistan. And then last, we'll look at state initiatives. By doing this, we'll look at the president's speeches. As the president is an autocrat in an autocratic nation, his speeches are executive orders, effectively. And look at Rahmon, the president, as his installation as a national symbol. Look at his crackdown on Islam and economic initiatives that his regime has enacted. So firstly, to identity and ethnicity. Bashiri further describes identity as a fluid, ever-changing, and mechanical phenomenon. Because of this fluidity, it's impossible to assign oneself a single identity or even a multiplicity of identity that would remain true over a period of time. He furthermore describes the first component of one's identity as a biological component, one that is innate and unshakable. This would undoubtedly envelop the notion of ethnicity. And though he maintains the notion that ethnicity is certainly multifaceted, nuanced, and works in a cog in the mechanical working and reworking of one's identity, it is a never fixed cog, meaning that social grouping along ethnic lines is fixed. Birds of a feather flock together after all. This is where, apart from him, and I agree with those like Armstrong, who suggest that ethnicity is a bundle of shifting interactions rather than a nuclear component of social organization. Meaning, like one's overall identity, ethnicity too is situational, and keeping with the analogy, birds of a feather don't necessarily flock together, however, they probably have the inclination to do so. But any conversation that dealing with Tajik ethnicity must first require us to look back into history. So, most Central Asian scholars subscribe to the historicity Gafurov laid forth in his prolific work, The Tajiks, Prehistory, Ancient, and Medieval History. The Tajiks, being identified by a unitary Tajik identity, came to be known as such under the rule of the Iranian Samanid Empire, centralized in Bukhara, 875-999 AD. It is noteworthy to mention here that, according to Gafurov's logic, the ethnogenesis of the Tajiks did not start with the Samanids, but rather ended with them, meaning that what we now consider to be Tajik in regards of linguistic, cultural, and ethnic influence was finished forming under Samanid rule. According to Bashiri, this newly formed Tajik identity was composed of three things: a development of a centralized Persian government, revival of the Persian language, and the revival of ancient Persian traditions in the region. And effectively, this was the last time that Persian or Iranian leaders had dominion over the Central Asian lands before the dominion of Turkic leaders. And moving on, so according to Byrne, the use of Tajik was first recorded in literature on Central Asia by the historian Bekaki, who reported a senior Iranian so describing his nationality in 1039. Furthermore, it is commonly accepted that the origin of the word Tajik stems from the Persian word Arab Tazi, before Arab Tazi. Taking this into account, we may define Tajiks as a Persian-speaking Arab people of Iranian descent formed under the rule of the Samanids of Bukhara. Two other factors that influence Tajik identity, both in history and today, are language and religion. And a defining factor for the advent of a Tajik identity was the revival of the Persian language, as I've just mentioned. However, even as late as the 1920s, there were inconsistencies in regard to the proper use of nomenclature. As Byrne notes, when Eastern Iranian language-speaking inhabitants of the mountainous region and Badakhshan district were asked to describe themselves, they did so by saying they were Tajiks. They went on to describe the Persian speakers as Farsigu, literally Persian speakers, whereas the Yanobis of the Zarafshan Valley described the Persian speakers as Tajiks and themselves as Yanobis. The Persian speakers of the mountains were more inclined to refer to themselves as Tajiks, where the Persian speakers of the cities and the plains, such as in Samarkand and Bukhara, were more inclined to refer to themselves along regional lines, such as Samarkandis or Bukharis. This was further complicated by the tendency for outside commentators to refer to all Persian-speaking peoples of Central Asia as Tajiks, regardless as to whether they were ethnic Afghans speaking Dari Persian, Western Iranians who spoke Farsi, or Tajiks who spoke Tajiki Persian. And in modern Tajikistan, the prevalence of Russian, Tajik, and Uzbek as primary languages is further complicated by a number of mutually unintelligible Iranian dialects distinct from Tajik and Farsi spoken in the Pamir Mountains, which this brings us to, here you can see just kind of some of the main religions and where they're spoken in Tajikistan, just good visuals. We have Tajik, pretty widespread. The Pamirs over here we'd have no information for, which is very strange. Russian, and Dushanbe and more metropolitan areas, and Uzbek, close to Uzbekistan and their Fergana Valley, just to kind of give you a visual. But this brings me to religion. The link between religious and national identity is an axiom in the study of the peoples of Soviet Central Asia, or was an axiom in people of Soviet Central Asia. This viewpoint holds that any members of the major nationalities of that region do not really necessarily differentiate between being a Muslim and belonging to the particular nationality. The two identities are inextricably intertwined, so that national customs are viewed as Islamic, and Islamic customs are viewed as national traditions. This is especially true in Tajikistan, where an overwhelming 98% of the population identify as Muslim. In reaches near and far of Tajikistan, when people are asked to identify, they will most commonly do so in terms of their religion by saying they are Muslim before they are all things, even before they identify with their region. This, however, is not firstly indicative of the state's failure in instilling a national identity or even the regional identities in the state, though they have failed in doing so, but more so firstly indicative of the immense importance of Islam to the people of Tajikistan, to the degree that it supersedes Tajikistani national identification, albeit a weak one. And which brings me to regionalism. It is also commonplace for inhabitants of Tajikistan to identify regionally before they do so nationally. This is not the case only for ideological reasons, but also for political and economic reasons, as their representatives, i.e. warlords, of their particular regions tend to look out for the people of their regions more so than the central government. This manifests itself economically as well, as there are often complaints in Tajikistan that all the best jobs are held from those from Rahmon's region, Kulyab, forcing others to work as migrant laborers abroad. As a result, no doubt, of the Kulyabi warlord and military having been the primary legitimizing force, and his personal private paramilitary during the early years of Rahmon's presidency. This disparity, however, is not unique to Rahmon's rule. From the beginning of their statehood, Tajikistan has experienced an inability by its strongman leaders to reconcile the cultural differences of their varying regions and allow for equal political and economic representation. Thus, the regions were divided the following way. Local elites in Leninabad, or Kujand, in the north, Kulyab in the south, Kulyab in the south, Garm in the center, Hisor in the west, and Badakhshan in the east, forming political parties and organizations that mobilize mass support exploiting traditional values in their respective communities. These political entities formed along regional lines, however, were not without internecine violence of their own, which gave rise to interclan violence and blood feuds, which ultimately rendered a country that was fundamentally incapable of operating at a macro level, engaged in violent conflict at every level of society, and this left a power vacuum, one that Rahmon and his Kulyabis took advantage of. Just kind of a context you can see here, kind of where the Kulyab, where Rahmon and most of the elite are from. Hisor is right around here, and Garm right here in the center. It's kind of easier, it's more even further regionalized map. Yeah, and here with the distinction of the Zarafshan and the Fergana Valley, just to give you a visual. And so by 1999, a restructuring of this highly regionalist state of Tajikistan was close to complete. The Kulyabi elite, including Rahmon, formed a working relationship with former rivals Garm, Matsko, and the Pamirs. The respective fighters were absorbed into Tajikistan's army, police force, and border security, and their respective commanders were placed in high government officials in hopes to quell any would-be rebellions. This move, though, meant to consolidate power and unify the regions did little in the way of influencing regional loyalty. Though wealth and resources were divided among the newly acquiescent regions, they were not divided among the nation evenly. As a result, the regions that came into new resources became more loyal to their former warlords, made government officials, and the regions that were not provided for only dug in further to the opposition to the central government. In essence, this move to unify only furthered the divide between which left a highly regionalist Tajikistan. And this emergence and reification of regional divides in Tajikistan have left the country in a particularly difficult situation to be handled by a particularly weak and short-reaching central government. So this brings us to kind of a summation of what we have as a Tajik identity right now. So to define their ethnic identity, not comprehensively, mind you, we can look at these 4 things. And moving forward with this is kind of an operational definition. So we want to have the Persian ethnic heritage and Samanid descent, which go hand in hand, a Tajiki Persian language, the importance of Islam on their identity, and regionalism. And beyond ethnic identity, it is also important to note the difference between a Tajik and a Tajikistani identity. While the former refers to an ethnic identification for the peoples who identify by some or all of the above mentioned criteria, the latter is a civic identification for the citizens of Tajikistan. The importance of a civic identification in a relatively homogeneous ethno-state is beyond reproach. However, as Tajikistan, the land of the Tajiks, is predominantly Tajik, and the preeminence of a Tajik identity has and must lay the groundwork for any civic identity, it is this identity that is most important to me in the scope of my research and in the scope of nation-building initiatives in Tajikistan, in my opinion. But this is not to diminish the importance of Tajikistani civic identification, but rather to underline the importance of an ethnic identification as a would-be predecessor and prerequisite of any civic identification. So, in a world of nations and nation-states, the next logical question to answer is, like after answering what constitutes a Tajik people, is what do the Tajik peoples constitute? It is safe at the very least to categorize them as an ethne, albeit a reluctant one, a given population, a social group whose members share a sense of common origins, claim a common and distinctive history, destiny, possesses one or more distinctive characteristics, and feel a sense of collective uniqueness and solidarity. Despite the fact that the inhabitants of Tajikistan may not overwhelmingly or even generally identify as actual Tajiks, the majority of them share a sense of common origin, history, and uniqueness, however they lack the solidarity. Their status as a state is irrefutable. They just are a state. But nevertheless, do the Tajik people of Tajikistan constitute a nation? According to Smith, a nation is a named human population sharing historic territory, common myths and historical memories, a mass public culture, a common economy, and a common legal rights and duties, and that have the ability to experience nationalism as an ideological movement for the attainment and maintenance of autonomy, unity, and identity on behalf of a population of some of whose members deemed to constitute an actual or a potential nation. By these standards, they do not. However, Smith goes on to write that nationhood is a specialized development of ethnicity. Thus, the Tajik people need only to embrace the development process. However, doing so would require first a collective ethnic identification. So though Tajikistan has already attained their autonomy, they have yet to achieve a unified people and identity. And as a result, they cannot experience the type of nation-building nationalism that Smith identifies, and are consequently stuck in a place of suspended statehood without a nation. However, where Smith identifies nationalism as a means of becoming and maintaining a nation, Armstrong identifies a nation as a prerequisite of any nationalism or nationalist sentiments. Where Smith and Armstrong disagree is not necessarily in the role of nationalism, but in the order in which it fulfills that role. And thus the paradox here is as follows. Nationalism creates and maintains the nation. Nations precede nationalism. The nation necessarily possesses a form of nationalism, or it is nominally unqualified to be a nation, and if it is not a nation, then it cannot experience nationalism. So it is here that, apart from Armstrong, and I agree with Smith further, that nationalism begets the nation by way of embracing ethnic identity as a catalyst for nationalism, which is subsequently the prerequisite of a nation. Everybody on board? Yes. Okay. So, however, looking back at the actual socioeconomic situation in Tajikistan today, while it is improving, there is still a significant vacuum in which many Tajikistanis find themselves. They find themselves without enough jobs at home, without proper social and infrastructural institutions to provide for their basic human needs, and without a vision of a future in which they would have these things, which brings me back to nationalism. As nationalism begets the nation, it promotes civic-minded citizens that subsequently promotes socioeconomic amelioration. However, national cohesiveness precedes nationalism, and national cohesiveness most probably will not be achieved without a sustainable socioeconomic situation to begin with. Thus, Tajikistanis aren't inspired to be civic-minded, and in turn will not work towards socioeconomic amelioration via national cohesiveness. This leaves Tajikistan today as a country that ostensibly requires socioeconomic advancement and subliminally requires nationalism as a means to attain it, but is crippled by competing regionalisms, inept governance, economic crisis, and otherwise nationally indifferent citizens. Which brings us to what the state is actually doing about the situation. So the state is left with reviving a Tajik collective identity if they ever hope to experience a Tajikistani population that is civic-minded. Identity and authority stand in a relationship of mutual dependency. They both have a reciprocal need to promote each other. And as Fedorenko stated, the most convenient way to get the authority and legitimacy is to support the large ethnic population because it is something tangible, something you can talk about, something easy to implement. Feeling Tajikistani for the majority of the country must be achieved through first feeling Tajik. So, in order to do this, the state has endeavored in various methods of nation building, including, but not exclusive to, drawing on their ancient Samanid heritage, the installation of Rahmon as a national symbol, a crackdown on Islamic influence, de-Russification, and economic initiatives, namely the nationalization and the completion of the Rogun Dam. So, firstly, looking at the ethnogenetic way they are trying to bolster the Tajik identity. In true showman form, the Tajikistan's president Emomali Rahmon gave little thought to academic merit or accurate historicity when claiming the presence and the role of Tajiks in Central Asia during an address where he stated the following. So I've had to stress again and again that it would be wrong to think that the first page in history of Tajik statehood was written with the founding of the Samanid state. Long before the Samanid epoch, the Tajiks had already established a number of states. Little wonder that the Tajiks are recognized as one of the oldest peoples of Central Asia who laid down the very foundations of civilization in these ancient lands. The Tajiks have a history stretching back many thousands of years. This, however, unfounded, still is rather effective and is further perpetuated by, here we have the Tajik ambassador to the United States in 2012, where he says almost verbatim the same things we can see here. Long before the Samanid epoch, the Tajiks had already established a number of states, and it's pretty much the exact same thing. These accounts, of course, break ranks with reputable scholarly work, like that of the above-mentioned Gafurov. However, the accuracy of these claims is of no consequence to their efficacy, and the vigor with which its promulgators promote it is certainly not exclusive to Tajikistan. Nations everywhere perpetuate national myths in the service of national cohesion. By drawing on inspiration of the glorious Samanid past, these narratives can foster the context in which the advancement of a common Tajik culture can take place, cultivating a sense of national cohesion. However, the loss of the tremendous cultural and linguistic and intellectual resources of Samarkand and Bukhara inhibit this process. And these are cities, in case you're unfamiliar, which are historically Tajik, or predominantly Tajik, but now they are in Uzbekistan. So, in addition to these, these notwithstanding, the fact that they've lost Samarkand and Bukhara notwithstanding, a national narrative of shared history, correct or otherwise, falls on deaf ears when the population to which it is being perpetuated lack the essential commodities to survive. However, this loss of Tajik cultural hubs is not an insurmountable obstacle in the way of nation building in Tajikistan. As one's identity is fluid and ever-changing, so too can be a collective identity. Though the reframing and revitalization of the Tajik people must include an acceptance of the departure from Bukhara and Samarkand, it need not forget the foundations of what constitute a Tajik that were founded there. Identity, the sense of collective peoplehood, is at its core a strategic remembering and forgetting of past events in a way to support the narrative that in turn supports the continuation of your peoplehood. Tajikistan can very well revive its sense of peoplehood without Samarkand and Bukhara. In further drawing on the Persian heritage, Rahmon has also taken notable steps to break with the Russian influence imposed on them during imperialist Russia and the Soviet Union. Most markedly, he changed his own name from Rahmonov to Rahmon, removing the Russian suffix "ov." This accompanied by further name restrictions for the entire nation, or for the entire state, regarding Turkic, Russian, and Arabic names, illustrate his aggressive push for Tajik purism. Somewhat inconsistently to his claims of an already established national consciousness, moving on to his speeches, of an established national consciousness in Tajikistan, President Emomali Rahmon consistently calls on such during his national speeches. Having poured through the transcripts of his speeches, I found two common thematic aspects. The first of which is that Tajikistan irrefutably and unwaveringly experiences sentiments of national unity. The second is that the need to do so is absolute. Without quoting all of the evidence for this, because there is a lot and it's super redundant, we can look just at a few examples of this. a 2004 Independence Day speech, he says that our nation evermore has had the factors of gradual, self-consistent revival of independence, self-knowledge, sustainable identity, and a practically unbreakable history. Furthermore, on the same occasion, in 2013, he says that since the independence and establishment of a sovereign state, it requires from every member of society vigilance, feelings of patriotism, loyalty, and honest work, and continued efforts and commitment. Moving on, here's in 2012, says today the nation's unity has to be that the major core and sense of independence as it is possible to imagine independence without national unity and national unity without independence. The fact that these two components are so common in Rahmon's speeches indicate three things to me. First is that he is keenly aware of the internal divisions and lack of national consciousness and unity in his country. Second, that he desperately needs to fix this. And thirdly, when juxtaposed with his actual economic initiatives that he has enacted, he's far more inclined to give grandiose speeches about national unity than he is to actually enact a policy that would instill it. As a side note, on here, it is also important to note here that there is a semi-separate push by the state to perpetuate the narrative of Aryan heritage. This is present not only in the state's ethnogenetic narrative writing, but also manifests itself in the religious sphere with components of Zoroastrianism being found in certain aspects of Tajiki Islam. This retroactive constitution of identity between Aryans and Tajiks permits the local historical science to monopolize this representation of the great empires of Asia Minor, the Achaemenids, the Epic of Alexander the Great, the Selavids, etc., while also being compatible with the Samanid narrative. And though these two narratives are in fact compatible and contiguous in that the Achaemenids were the predecessors of the Samanids, the latter is from which the Tajik people can attribute their current cultural identity with evidentiary support. Furthermore, the Aryan myth has another motive, to fuel racism towards Uzbeks by further distancing themselves from their ethnic heritage by claiming Indo-European descent. But this is not super relevant for what we're doing here. So, which brings us back to Rahmon and his installation of himself as a national symbol. In following the dictatorial traditions of his neighboring states, Rahmon has taken steps to ensure that he is the national symbol of Tajikistan. In 2015, he was anointed by Parliament as leader of the nation, a status that effectively protects him and his entire family from prosecution for life. He also dedicated a day to himself where children write essays in competition about his heroic rule, quote. Following this, more substantially, May 22nd, 2016 referendum, Parliament eliminated the term limit for Rahmon and lowered the required age of the presidency from 35 to 30, and also banning any future formation of religiously based political entities. With a comical 94.5% of approval from the citizens of Tajikistan, we can probably almost be certain, I didn't check on this, but that wasn't a super fair vote, but I feel safe saying it wasn't. This did three things. It allowed him to serve for president as life, effectively, and it also is ostensibly setting the stage for his son, Rustam Imamali, who is 29 right now, to succeed him should he choose to step down. And it has quelled any future opposition from Islamic opposition parties, which have been the majority of the people who oppose him would be along religious lines. It also has effectively established a monarchist rule in Tajikistan. And looking at the above-mentioned Aryan myth, Rahmon's other use of this narrative is to further legitimize himself by painting himself as the heir to the cultural throne of some of the world's greatest historical empires. It's even been noted for a few accounts where people are calling on him to be the cultural heir to Yamshid's throne, which is referring to the city of Persepolis, the capital of the Achaemenid Empire in Iran, which is beyond ridiculous. But, moves on to initiatives regarding Islam. And so while Islam holds its place of importance in history for the Tajik peoples and is still a powerful force in the country today, the road from the former to the latter was not one without obstacles. During the Soviet Union, Soviets closed mosques, repressed religious leaders, and stifled Islam's role in society, effectively all but banning it completely. Participation in Islamic customs such as the Hajj, circumcisions, fasting, and praying were all but banned. What was left was a bastardization of Islam that was less threatening to the atheist Soviet regime. However, Muslims in Tajikistan in recent years have drastically increased the frequency and degree to which they demonstrate their religiosity. This revival of Islam in Tajikistan runs paradoxically parallel with the state's crackdown on Islam. In an attempt to ostensibly stifle terroristic or potentially terroristic activity, the central government has taken a viciously secular approach toward the role of Islam in politics in Tajikistan. As a result of the '94 law on religion and religious organizations, Islamic customs and Muslim officials in Tajikistan are all but paralyzed in the political sphere. Even more recently, Tajikistan has moved to ban Arabic and foreign names, as well as moved to ban marriages between first cousins, a phenomenon that is fairly common among Muslims in Tajikistan. This further crackdown on religious expression has been met with widespread disapproval. And through its overbearing attempts to control the debate on Islam, the Tajik government is alienating Tajik citizens, or Tajikistani citizens, and possibly even fueling what it deems illegal Islamic activity. As Tajikistanis begin to place growing importance on religion in their lives, the gulf between Tajikistan's religious believers and secular government could become even wider. And through these measures to quell any would-be extremists, they very well may have driven those who otherwise would not have become radicalized into radicalization, inflaming tensions that were present during the Civil War by marginalizing moderates as well as would-be extremists. It's also noteworthy here to comment on the contradictory and peculiar nature of President Rahmon's own religiosity. Despite his vicious attacks on Islam, but in keeping with his promulgation of the Aryan myth, he has claimed that Zarathustra was the first prophet of the Tajiks, thus superimposing the myth of Aryanism and Zoroastrianism in an attempt to identify with Islam as it exists in Tajikistan and Zoroastrianism as the Aryan myth dictates existed among the predecessors of the Tajik people, the Achaemenids or the Aryans. And here is him actually in Mecca and this charade with all of his cronies. So, this series of disconnectedness and inconsistencies regarding religion and in Tajikistan further widens the divide between its inhabitants and its government. As a result of not seeing eye to eye on key cultural issues, such as religion, it is directly consequential to the people's sentiments of national belongingness and cohesion. This leaves residents of Tajikistan skeptical of their government and reluctant to identify with it, which brings us on to more substantial initiatives such as economic initiatives. The first and most consequential economic and infrastructural initiative in Tajikistan is its longest ongoing one, the Rogun Dam. The Rogun Dam was a Soviet project on the Vaksh River, poised to be the tallest dam in the world. However, due to many different things, it has been suspended. This including the Civil War in '92 and '97, of course, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a devastating flood in '93, a halt because of a World Bank assessment in 2012, and a series of unrealized contracts that left the dams further suspended and in completion. The state of the dam being perpetually stranded and suspended animation has left the countries desperately wanting in regard to energy and water supplies. Currently, around 70% of the Tajik population experience extensive electricity shortages during the winter, which alongside their social economic loss is estimated around $200 million USD, or $200 million a year. Under such circumstances, the potential for energy independence and socioeconomic amelioration for Tajikistan is unparalleled by any other initiative in the country's short history. Namely, as Tajikistan's electricity production from hydroelectric sources accounts for around 97% of their total electricity production, and the country's total installed capacity of 4,000 megawatts would almost double with the additional 3,600 megawatts that the Rogun Dam would offer. This would allow Tajikistan not only to become energy self-sufficient, but it would also allow them to sell energy to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Uzbekistan, albeit the latter of which would have some pretty negative geopolitical repercussions. And all of these tangible improvements to Tajikistan notwithstanding, the completion of this dam would further serve to legitimize the central government and consolidate regional and national power while laying the groundwork for establishing a national unity. However, as Tajikistan is crippled by economic strife, this has yet to come to fruition, and the Rahmon's attempts to remedy this have left the situation wanting. So if the dam was to be a symbol for the central government's success and a catalyst for national unity, its continued incompletion is so for failure and division. Other spending by Rahmon has also exacerbated the feelings of division and distrust in the government, as the government seemingly spends on frivolous endeavors and grandiosity, while such projects as the Rogun Dam maintain their state of incompletion. Among these were right now is under construction, it's a $100 million project for the Central Asia's largest theater, the world's largest tallest flagpole, Central Asia's largest library, here we can hear, and here's the library, Central Asia's most capacious tea house, and Central Asia's largest museum, the Norwes Palace in Dushanbe for diplomatic meetings and just to kind of show off their fanciness. But these imprudent ventures are certainly an attempt to burnish the reputation of the former Soviet state's poorest state. However, they have been effective only in regard that they have sown further distrust in the division and impatience of the people of Tajikistan, and as a result left them feeling less than nationalistic. Because while these great grandiose projects are working in favor of Rahmon and his regime and evidently bolstering the reputation of Tajikistan in Central Asia, the people live in conditions that are less than desirable. Here, most children there's a high occurrence of children dropping out of school in Tajikistan because their parents are often, or their fathers are typically migrant workers, oftentimes in Russia, to pay for things, and so they have to work at home or in their farms. We have poverty headcount, just to kind of juxtapose, where crisis level almost throughout the entire country. Here's a bit simpler of a map to illustrate that. For overall food insecurity, where it is absolutely dire. Which brings me to my conclusion. As nationalism begets the nation, it promotes civic-minded citizens that subsequently promote socioeconomic amelioration. However, as national cohesiveness precedes nationalism, and national cohesiveness most probably will not be achieved without a sustainable socioeconomic situation to begin with, the people of Tajikistan are not inspired to feel Tajik and are not inspired to be civic-minded, and in turn will not work towards socioeconomic amelioration via national cohesiveness. Thus, reviving their peoplehood, becoming a nation, is a key to advancing a Tajik society, albeit somewhat paradoxically, as a necessity to revitalize a Tajik identity that can evolve into a Tajikistani civic identity stems from the poor socioeconomic situation of the country. And the poor socioeconomic situation discourages national cohesion, which is of course a prerequisite for everything. Thus, the key to ameliorating the socioeconomic situation in Tajikistan is to reconcile the harmful initiatives with the beneficial ones. Firstly, the vicious crackdown on Islam and blatant infringement on basic human rights must be calmed. The fact that the overwhelming majority of the population is Muslim notwithstanding, when people feel more like sheep than they do humans, they are less inclined to identify with those that would make them into mutton the way they want. Secondly, the rampant regionalism that plagues the country needs to be addressed, not attacked. This can be done by also addressing the third point, by completing the Rogun Dam. By completing the hydroelectric dam, Tajikistan's economy and energy security would almost instantaneously improve drastically. This would also give them leverage over the other regions by having the water resources and the energy resources that these regions also so desperately need, giving the central government a far more reaching hand than it has right now. Which leads to the fourth point also, to cease frivolous government spending in attempts to bolster a Tajik national reputation. This only further marginalizes those who have not by showing that those who have would rather spend on these grand projects than on their own people. Points 5 and 6 can go hand in hand. The symbolization of Rahmon and the promulgation of the Samanid narrative can work towards reestablishing a Tajik identity once the socioeconomic situation has been improved. The Samanid narrative has the advantage of being both historically accurate and being a great usable past for building a people's identity and tying that identity to their glorious past. The symbolization of Rahmon is also not necessarily a harmful thing, though ultimately it is damaging to any democratic institutions that may exist in Tajikistan in the future. For the time being, if Rahmon can create a better life for his people and earn the title leader of a nation, then perhaps his position as such could be a force to galvanize the people of Tajikistan and inspire national unity. Ultimately, if all these things could come together, Tajikistan could have a bright future. But at the very core of this is the socioeconomic situation. If Rahmon can't first improve the socioeconomic situation of his people, then everything else will fall on deaf ears, as has been the majority of his tenure at the helm. And so, while I wrote the title for this back in October, and in the middle of research, I titled it Beyond Ethnicity and Nationalism. However, after doing lots of research, I kind of realized that my title was not necessarily apt, and a more apt title would be Before Ethnicity and Nationalism, because initially I thought that these things were going to be a factor and then a factor that was looked over, but in fact the way that I understand it now is that ethnicity and nationalism are in fact a factor, but they're not a factor until these other more dire factors, I've said factors far too many times, have been dealt with. And so a more apt title would very well be Being Tajik Before Ethnicity and Nationalism. And questions? A lot of information.
All right, well, first let's give the round of applause.